By the time Eddie Griffin turned 55, he decided he was done holding his tongue. After years of staying quiet, he finally spoke out about what he claims Tyler Perry did behind the scenes, acts he says involved calculated manipulation, legal intimidation, and a culture of silence enforced through fear. According to Griffin, what once sounded like wild warnings are now beginning to line up with unfolding events. For years, rumors circulated quietly, massive lawsuits buried under non-disclosure agreements, victims pressured into silence, and patterns that suggested something far more systematic than coincidence. Griffin insists he tried to warn people long before the headlines caught up. Now, with Hollywood's most untouchable figures steadily losing their shields, those early alarms no longer seem so easy to dismiss. Tyler Perry, who has long cultivated a carefully polished public image, recently found himself at the center of serious controversy after a male actor from his series The Oath filed a staggering $260 million lawsuit. The timing couldn't be more striking. As powerful industry figures continue to fall, Griffin believes the truth he's been sitting on may finally shake Perry's entire empire. And that's exactly why this conversation can't be ignored. To understand how Eddie Griffin became the man willing to speak up, you have to go back to the beginning. On July 15, 1968, Edward Reuben Griffin was born into the tough streets of Kansas City, Missouri. Life didn't offer him much comfort early on. His mother, Doris Thomas, worked long, exhausting hours as a phone company operator, raising Eddie alone and doing everything she could to keep their small family afloat. Money was tight, stability was fragile, and survival came first. They were also deeply rooted in the Jehovah's Witness faith, a rigid religious environment that shaped Eddie's early outlook on life. The strict rules, moral pressure, and constant discipline would later become rich material for his comedy, though at the time, it was simply the world he knew. School became Eddie's first real stage. At Lincoln College Preparatory Academy, he earned a reputation that followed him for years: class clown, 3 times over. While other students chased grades or athletic trophies, Eddie sharpened something else entirely: the ability to turn hardship into humor. He learned how to make people laugh not because life was easy, but because it wasn't. Teachers were divided. Some recognized his brilliance. Others saw him as a disruption. But even the harshest critics couldn't deny his raw, instinctive talent. Eddie had a presence, you noticed him whether you wanted to or not. That drive showed up early. At just 16 years old, he launched his own dance studio, blending creativity with hustle. His skill on the dance floor was undeniable, earning him opportunities to choreograph halftime performances for the Kansas City Chiefs. For a while, it looked like everything was lining up perfectly. Then came the night that changed everything. In 1989, Eddie was hanging out at Sanford & Sons Comedy Club, not as a performer, but as an observer. During the evening, his cousin dared him to get on stage. Eddie had never done stand-up comedy before. No preparation. No plan. Just a challenge hanging in the air. Something inside him refused to back down. That moment, born out of pressure, instinct, and pure nerve, would quietly set the course for everything that followed. He stepped onto the stage with nothing written down, no jokes memorized, no safety net, just instinct, confidence, and a lifetime of watching people, pain, and patterns. What followed caught everyone off guard, Eddie included. What was supposed to be a 3-minute dare unraveled into a 45-minute eruption of non-stop laughter. The room was electrified. People were on their feet, shouting for him to keep going, hanging on every word. Eddie riffed effortlessly, about his family, his upbringing, the block he grew up on, and the reality of being a young black man navigating America. Somehow, he transformed everyday struggle into comedy that felt raw, honest, and irresistibly funny. The audience couldn't get enough, and for the first time, Eddie realized neither could he. When he walked off that stage, he knew with absolute clarity that his life had just shifted forever. Not long after, he made a move that shocked everyone around him. He scraped together whatever money he had, bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles, and said goodbye to Kansas City for good. His mother thought he was out of his mind. Friends were convinced he'd be back before the year was over. But Eddie had felt something that night at Sanford & Sons, something addictive, undeniable, and he wasn't willing to let it slip away. That long Greyhound ride west was packed with hope and hunger, but very few answers. Eddie was still just a kid from the projects with a sharp mind and a faster mouth, heading straight into an industry overflowing with talent and short on mercy. As he stared out the bus window, he had no idea that this journey would eventually place him face to face with some of Hollywood's most powerful figures, or that his refusal to stay quiet would later make him a problem in an industry that thrives on silence and polished illusions. When Eddie Griffin arrived in Los Angeles in 1990, reality wasted no time introducing itself. The dream city hit hard. Within months, he was homeless, sleeping in shelters, on park benches, anywhere he could rest his head. By day, he took whatever work he could find, painting houses, washing dishes, just to survive. By night, he chased stage time, begging clubs for a chance to perform, refusing to quit even when the odds looked impossible. Everything changed when Eddie created a razor-sharp parody of Andrew Dice Clay. The impression was so accurate, and so funny, that it started buzzing through the comedy scene. Word eventually reached Dice Clay himself. Instead of taking offense, he was impressed. So impressed, in fact, that he invited Eddie to open for him on a 22-city tour. Overnight, the same man who'd been sleeping rough was now performing in packed venues, standing under bright lights in front of thousands. But it was back at the Comedy Store where Eddie truly cemented his reputation. Night after night, he'd walk into open mic sessions and deliver sets so long and intense that audiences were left completely drained from laughing. Other comedians hated going on after him. Eddie would leave nothing behind, no energy, no breath, no room for recovery. Regulars at the club started calling him the Endurance King, because no one else could hold a crowd captive for that long without losing momentum. It was during this period that Eddie began noticing things that didn't sit right. Hecklers who felt rehearsed. Audience members who seemed less like fans and more like observers. Moments that felt too perfectly timed to be accidental. Slowly, he began forming his own theories about how entertainers with growing influence were watched, tested, and subtly controlled once they became too powerful on stage. His official Hollywood breakthrough came in 1991 with a small role in The Last Boy Scout alongside Bruce Willis. At last, the industry was paying attention. But even as doors opened and opportunities expanded, Eddie stayed grounded in where he came from, and committed to using comedy as a weapon for truth, not comfort. Those unsettling encounters with what he believed were planted hecklers didn't stop. They followed him. He later claimed that an incident in Oakland, where a woman threw a drink at him mid-performance, wasn't random at all, but part of a broader effort to intimidate comedians who dared to challenge powerful interests. To Eddie Griffin, comedy was never just about laughs. It was about saying the things others were afraid to say, and paying the price for it. When the woman who threw the drink attempted to sue him, Eddie refused to back down. He fought the case head-on, and won. But the victory did little to ease his mind. If anything, it confirmed what he had already begun to believe: the entertainment industry didn't move randomly. There were systems in place, invisible lines of power, and consequences for those who didn't play along. By the mid-1990s, Eddie Griffin had carved out a reputation as one of the boldest voices in American comedy. He wasn't just funny, he was unfiltered, confrontational, and unapologetic. He spoke where others softened their words, and that fearlessness earned him both loyal fans and powerful enemies. Just as his career was solidifying, his path began to overlap with another black entertainer rising in a completely different way. While Eddie was battling the system from the outside, Tyler Perry was quietly mastering it from within. Perry's story, on the surface, was inspiring, surviving homelessness and abuse to build what would eventually become a billion-dollar entertainment empire. But to Eddie, the method mattered just as much as the outcome. Their philosophies couldn't have been more different. Where Eddie refused to dilute his voice or reshape himself for approval, Perry appeared willing to adapt, strategically, to whatever the market rewarded. Eddie first took notice of Perry in the early 2000s, when Perry's stage plays began dominating Southern audiences. One detail stood out immediately: Perry's breakout character, Medea, was built on cross-dressing comedy. To Eddie, who had rooted his career in raw honesty and unapologetic masculinity, this felt deeply uncomfortable. While Eddie stood firmly in his own skin, Perry was literally stepping into a wig and dress to win over crowds. As Perry moved from stage productions to blockbuster films, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Movies like Diary of a Mad Black Woman and Medea's Family Reunion exploded commercially. But Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had clawed for every inch of progress in an industry that questioned, resisted, and challenged him at every step, yet Perry seemed to glide forward, doors opening effortlessly. Behind the scenes, stories began circulating. Fellow comedians and actors spoke quietly about uneasy environments on Perry sets. Some described blurred boundaries between professionalism and personal dynamics. Others said maintaining their roles required navigating Perry's moods, expectations, and unspoken rules with extreme caution. Each story only sharpened the contrast Eddie saw growing year after year. While Eddie was scrutinized relentlessly for his political commentary and social critiques, Perry seemed almost untouchable, despite ongoing criticism about how his work portrayed black women, families, and trauma. What unsettled Eddie even more was learning about Perry's business structure. Perry held an extraordinary level of control, full ownership of his content, his own studio in Atlanta, and near total independence from the traditional Hollywood power chain. That kind of freedom was rare, almost unheard of. To Eddie, it raised an uncomfortable question: What deals had been made for that level of access and protection? As Perry's influence expanded, Eddie noticed a familiar pattern. Critics were dismissed. Questioners were sidelined. Supporters were rewarded. It looked eerily similar to the control mechanisms Eddie believed governed the industry at large. Two philosophies of black entertainment were now moving on a collision course. Then came June 13, 2025. The industry was shaken when a 46-page lawsuit was filed in Los Angeles Superior Court against Tyler Perry. Actor Derek Dixon, who had appeared in 85 episodes of Perry's hit series The Oval, sought $260 million in damages. His claims were explosive: years of sexual misconduct, coercion, and professional retaliation by one of Hollywood's most powerful figures. According to the lawsuit, Dixon first met Perry in 2019 while working event staff at one of Perry's Atlanta parties. Perry allegedly took an immediate interest in him, promising career opportunities and offering small acting roles. What began as mentorship, Dixon claimed, slowly turned into something far more disturbing. The filing detailed alleged explicit text messages, including one message that asked, "What's it going to take for you to be guiltless?" When Dixon attempted to keep things professional, Perry allegedly escalated, using his influence over Dixon's career as leverage. The most serious allegations centered on events said to have occurred at Perry's Atlanta mansion. Dixon claimed that in June 2021, he was invited to discuss a potential pilot he had written. Instead of a business meeting, the lawsuit alleged that Perry isolated him in a guest house, forcibly pulled down his underwear, and groped him without consent. According to the complaint, this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a repeated pattern. Perry allegedly used his power to isolate young talent, make them dependent on his approval, and gradually increase demands. When Dixon's character on The Oval was shot multiple times at the end of the first season, the lawsuit claimed Perry made it clear the character's survival depended on Dixon's willingness to comply. For Eddie Griffin, these allegations didn't come as a shock. To him, they sounded like confirmation. For Eddie Griffin, watching the accusations against Tyler Perry surface felt less like a revelation and more like confirmation. In his eyes, the man celebrated for faith-based messaging and moral authority was now being accused of weaponizing that very image to exploit people with less power. The spotless public persona, Eddie believed, was finally cracking, exposing what he claimed had been hidden for years. When the allegations made headlines, Eddie didn't react with disbelief. There was no stunned silence, no cautious distancing. Instead, there was a sense of grim validation. According to him, the truth he'd been hinting at for a long time was finally stepping into the light. In interviews and on social media, Eddie began speaking more openly about what he described as Hollywood's long-standing habit of shielding influential figures. True to form, his language was direct and unapologetic. He framed Perry not as a mastermind, but as someone clumsy compared to others who had refined manipulation into an art form. His provocative references, like invoking Diddy Juice in comparison to Sean Combs, were meant to underline a larger point. Perry, in Eddie's view, was careless enough to get caught. Eddie went further, recounting what he said were personal observations over the years. He described industry gatherings where Perry's behavior around younger male actors and crew members raised red flags. According to Eddie, there were moments, especially at parties, where alcohol allegedly loosened boundaries, leading to inappropriate touching and sexually charged remarks that left him deeply uneasy. But Eddie insisted the issue went far beyond one individual. He claimed Perry was surrounded by a protective infrastructure, lawyers, intermediaries, and fixers, whose role was to identify threats early and make them disappear. Actors who tried to step away, Eddie alleged, were met with strategic pressure, tempting offers, career incentives, or quiet warnings about what refusing could cost them. He also spoke about casting dynamics he believed were far from innocent. According to Eddie, some roles allegedly came with unspoken expectations. Those who declined to engage personally with Perry, he claimed, saw their characters abruptly written out or sidelined. Meanwhile, performers who complied were rewarded with more screen time and expanded story arcs. Eddie hinted at even darker consequences for those who pushed back too hard, speaking cryptically about people whose careers collapsed overnight or who experienced unexplained incidents after crossing Perry. While he avoided making explicit accusations, the implications were unmistakable. To Eddie Griffin, this wasn't just about alleged misconduct, it was about a system. A structure, he claimed, built on fear, leverage, and silence. Speaking out against Perry, in his view, was really about pulling the curtain back on an industry that protects abusers while discarding those they harm. As new details continued to emerge, Eddie positioned himself not as a commentator chasing attention, but as someone finally saying out loud what others were afraid to acknowledge. That decision, however, came at a price. Within days of going public, Eddie said he began receiving anonymous threats urging him to back off. Rather than intimidating him into silence, the messages only strengthened his belief that influence invites control. He had long argued that performers who command large audiences eventually become targets, and now, he felt he was living proof. Even as pressure mounted, Eddie continued speaking. He claimed there was a wider circle around Perry, powerful individuals who allegedly helped enable the behavior and ensured complaints never reached police or journalists. Some, he said, were widely admired public figures whose reputations bore no resemblance to their alleged private actions. Eddie's warnings about plants in audiences suddenly took on sharper meaning. He alleged that people were being deliberately placed at his shows to provoke incidents, disrupt performances, or create moments that could later be used to undermine his credibility. According to him, some of these individuals were connected to Perry's orbit, while others were part of broader industry efforts to rein in voices that refused to fall in line. For Eddie Griffin, the backlash only reinforced what he believed all along: in Hollywood, the truth doesn't just surface, it has to survive. Eddie Griffin also claimed to understand the financial machinery that, in his view, allowed Tyler Perry to operate with near-total impunity. According to Eddie, Perry's enormous fortune wasn't merely a symbol of success, it was leverage. He alleged that money was routinely used as a weapon, to pacify accusers, manage fallout, and ensure silence. Eddie described what he believed to be a dedicated pool of funds set aside to resolve complaints quietly, offering victims enough financial security to start over, on the condition that they signed ironclad non-disclosure agreements. As Eddie continued to speak, his claims began to outline something much bigger than one powerful man. In his telling, Perry was not an anomaly but a visible symptom of a deeply entrenched system, one where access, opportunity, and longevity often hinged less on talent and more on obedience. Hollywood, Eddie suggested, rewards those who comply and isolates those who resist. For Eddie Griffin, calling out Perry was never about revenge or personal grudges. It was about exposing what he saw as the real price of success in an industry built on hierarchy and fear. He wanted people to understand that challenging power doesn't just risk careers, it can cost friendships, stability, and, in extreme cases, a person's entire livelihood. In Eddie's view, silence isn't accidental in Hollywood, it's enforced. And speaking up, no matter how justified, comes with consequences few are willing to face. And with that, Eddie made his point, and stepped back, leaving the audience to decide what to believe next.